Obviously, the very first Americans that came to the United States, the very first Muslims that came to the United States, came on the boat with Christopher Columbus, right? They were slaves that were from Spain, and they had two options. One was that they were either to be killed in Spain if they didn't convert, or they were put on the boat to come to the New World and be forgotten about. So that is actually the history of American Muslims. But I want to fast forward a little bit to the first idea of a governmental sponsored mosque in the United States. This was in 1957. It was built by the donation of three countries. It was Turkey, Egypt, and Iran. President Eisenhower really commended the Muslim community for the work that they're doing in the US. And then roughly around 1965, that's when the big boom of American Muslims really happened. At this point, there was 1.1 million Muslims in the US, which is, phenomenal to see that. And then, of course, between the 1980s and the 1991s, a series of really rich oil countries come in, and what I kind of laugh and say, it's, we will sponsor your mosque, and we'll throw in the free imam. So it's kind of like, you kind of do this little dance. But I actually want to point out this specific mosque because this mosque is in New York. It's actually designed by Skidmore, Owing and Merrill. And this mosque itself was just the body of the mosque. That's what the funding came from the Emir of Kuwait and etc. And this mosque did not have a minaret, okay? And I emphasize this because I'm going to get to a later portion of my talk about why this is so significant. But the Rockefellers came by and they said, oh my God, there's no such thing as a mosque without a minaret. We have to have a minaret. And they said, well, how much is that going to cost us? And so they said, okay, it's roughly about $1 million. And they said, sure, we'll donate $1 million. It has to have a minaret. So to put this in perspective, thanks to Mr. Rockefeller, Orientalist point of view, wanted to have a $1 million non-functioning minaret. So that's how he spent his money. Imagine what you could do with $1 million nowadays. But I'll go into that later. So then followed with a whole series of other mosques. So this is a mosque right across from USC. And everybody started formatting a whole series of either mid-century modern, this is actually a mid-century modern building, and of course next to it, it's a non-functioning minaret, and we have a dome, and so now we have a series of iconoclast identity buildings that actually have no purpose whatsoever for them. But you know what? We get to point it out and say these are mosques. But just to kind of, again, frame things back into perspective, this is a graph to see how many of the mosques were built. So you can see from the 1960s to about 1980s, there's a huge boom of mosques building. And then roughly around 1990, and I mean in the 2000s, this is where it stops because obviously 2001, the 9/11 events happen. And so the whole Muslim community kind of goes quiet for a while. And this becomes the point of where my question of identity, what does it mean to really be a Muslim and to occupy a space, really comes in. So this is a graph of like all the mosques that we've documented. So I've personally, one summer, maybe I was bored, maybe I was young, I will never know. I will probably disclose it later on in my life. But I jumped into a car, and from Boston, I traveled and documented and prayed. I have prayed in 380 American mosques. 380 American mosques. I have, yeah. and I was telling a friend earlier today, I said, whenever I go to a great place that I really love, my grandfather used to tell me, memorize Surah Mulk, because when you die, your soul will go pick up all the places that you have buried Surah Mulk. And I said, well, Grandpa, does that mean I get to travel the whole world if I go to all these places and read Surah Mulk? And he said, yes. So now I have also recited 380 Surah Mulks in all these different mosques so that my soul travels to them one more time in that world. But this is to say there's about 2,800 American mosques. To kind of put this into perspective, the city of Houston itself has 2,800 churches, okay? So we are really just a niche. But although if you look, you can see majority of the clusters of the area are really, there's like the hub, you've got the hub in California, and you kind of have a really long hub on the East Coast. And of course in the South too. And what I did was I went in, we drew all these mosques, we documented them, we did site plans, floor plans, elevations, because at that time I was really studying the notion of the body in a mosque, so the gender issues. And again, all of this is free, it's archived, we've donated it, it's archived in the Aga Khan program, so everybody has access to this. But at the time we were really studying, what are the women's spaces, what are the men's spaces. And one thing that became very clear to us is that our Muslim community were obviously hiring non-Muslims and dictating what a mosque should be to the architect. And in order for the architect to continue their commission, they're going to say yes. So they were never going to challenge the community itself. But the community itself needed to really rethink the architectural programming of a space. So this came down to the foundational root of how we practice Islam in a way. So I'm going to go through these very fast, and I showed them so that you guys can understand to see, for example, the minaret has no form. I have no idea what the copper dome is supposed to be. But you can see that all of these brand new American mosques that are being built in the name of Muslim identity is actually sort of against our way of living as Muslims. And the reason for it is because building constructions from bottom to ground up is actually 40% of emission. So we are actually contributing, every time we build a mosque, we are contributing to carbon emission out into the world. So the bigger question that I have for everybody, it goes back to the prophetic mosque. If this is the prophetic mosque by the prophet, he did not use anything that was hurtful to the earth, right? So his mosques were rammed earth, adobe, architecturally programmatical. They were apartments or the houses for his family right nearby. The courtyard itself was used for communal gathering, also for farming. And so there was many levels of multi-purpose aspect to each of these mosques. And for him, the specific mosque that he had designed for himself to be in there. So the bigger question that I started also asking is, if the whole earth is a mosque, right? But what is a mosque? Why have we gone in the United States and designed all these one-dimensional layered mosques that are only used for Friday prayers? If we're lucky, right? Only the month of Ramadan, we might all congregate at them. But that means that 90% of the time, they're empty, and we have contributed to 40% of carbon emission. So how are we living the prophetic sunnah if the whole earth is a mosque? And the other question is this really Islamic architecture? Are all these domes and minarets without functional purposes? Are they really Islamic architecture, or are they Islamic identity that you and I have adapted because that's what we grew up with? The other questions become, what is cultural and historical features? Are mosque Islamic architecture in places in America? Is it for our society? But the bigger question that we started asking in reality is the mosque just for the Anthropocene? And is the Anthropocene hurting the earth by building mosques? So now what are we doing? So is a mosque just for us? Are we that egotistic that we are now creating spaces just for us? Or can the mosque be a sanctuary for every living cell beyond the Anthropocene? So how are we going to get there? And I started questioning a lot of this because of the Quran, right? So Surah 33, Al-Ashab, Ayah 72, talks about the responsibility and sustainability issues that we have as Muslims when it comes to the built environment. If God indeed trusted us with the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but we refuse to undertake it because we are so hung-go about building brand new buildings and contributing to 40% of carbon emission, have we now committed a sin by building a mosque? So these are questions that I'm just posing out there because I'm still kind of thinking through them myself. So in terms of gender and sexuality in mosque, I kind of, once I gave it over to the archives of the Aga Khan, like I said, everyone has access to them. You guys can go through all the 3,000 something pictures that I have there and see all the analysis. I started focusing more on other relative projects. We were commissioned recently with the LA 2028 Olympic Gateway. So when you come into this is the city of Los Angeles. This is the LA 2028 Grand Gateway opens up right when you enter LAX. It's the opening of the city of El Segundo. The gateway will be right when everybody flies over. When we were commissioned, before we were commissioned, when we were building on it and bidding on it, we were thinking, how do you create, we looked at all of these different ideas of what an Olympic gateway was supposed to be. And I decided with my team that we were just going to go rogue. We were going to go do something that had nothing to do with the Olympic Gateway, but rather had to do with what is there. What is our responsibility, especially my responsibility as a Muslim, to the built environment. And we presented our whole concept was about the endangered blue butterfly. So we built the gateway in terms of how do we create a space for the endangered blue butterfly. So you can see the amount of carbon emission that comes out from LAX every time a flight takes off hurts the blue butterflies that live there. So what we decided to do was create a sanctuary in this 10-acre strip of land for homes for the blue butterfly. And every time a series of nights in the summertime when the blue butterfly do come out, they lay these beautiful lights when they're glowing, and so it creates this very spiritual moment. But more so, when we won the commission for this, it moved away from the idea of the Anthropocene and the gateway of an Olympic, but it started becoming more of a conversation about what is our responsibility when we do create spaces for living cells, such as the blue butterfly. And so we were thinking a lot about, the whole seasonal thing, what happens, what is our responsibility to insects, because even at the end of the day, when every time we read the Quran, we talk about Naml, Nahl, and Kabut, there's a reason why God has put those chapters. They're not little verses, right? They're chapters. That means that we are responsible for these insects in the way that we live. So we started thinking more about how do you move beyond the built environment and bring back these living creatures. So we started thinking about plants and insects, light and shadow. And I'm using these because, again, this is another one of our projects. This is the San Jose Gateway. And I'm going through them fast to get to the mosques. But this is, again, another point. This is the Coyote Creek Trail. It's been dried up. We've been commissioned to, again, create an atmosphere so that humans now are able to interact with plants and insects, because it's so important that we teach our children about the life cycle, about how to live, and how these animals and these insects contribute to our whole ecosystem, which is all laid out in the Quran itself. So having won a whole series of these commissions, we were also given the opportunity to be a part of the Nature Conservancy, which many of you might know. They are nonprofit organizations. They go and they save a lot of land. And then this is one of the projects that we worked on, but a developer had come in, bought 28,000 acres of property, and they started cutting down a whole bunch of trees to build residences, what we call McMansions. So these 30,000 square feet homes with golf courses and etc. When they gave us the project, we realized that they had cut down roughly about 3,000 oak trees, and it had hurt the biometric Mediterranean atmosphere of this particular land. And what I started realizing is what happens every time we build a mosque, we cut down a tree just to build a mosque. We're taking away 120 years of life, because that's how long it takes for a tree to be rooted into the ground. That means it's 7 generations. So we've ruined 7 generations of oxygen for the next generation, whereas we should have been being able to basically create a mosque around that tree and preserve that tree. So the Nature Conservancy came to us and they said they've already ruined this land. And we did this analysis to see how long it would take for these little baby oak trees that we're going to plant, for them to get to a healthy space. It would take about 10 years just for them to grow to be 2 feet tall, let alone for them to become more than 30 feet tall and have a span. And the 10-year is a critical point because squirrels and deers won't eat them anymore. So then they're always in threat. But the Nature Conservancy came to us and they said, this is already damaged, let's just go ahead and create the opportunity to create classrooms for science students. And what we decided to do was tap into a more ecological portion. Was how do we create not a classroom for children, but a habitat for all other living beings. So what are all these animals? What's there? And how do we create an ecosystem that the Anthropocene and the Earth become one? So in lieu of a built classroom, we started designing more of an outdoor classroom where science can be done outside. And so these kinds of thoughts in a meditation area, and a prayer area, these kinds of thoughts started transferring for us. And then let me just show you one more thing. So just so everybody knows, the preserve that we're working on is right at the corner of California. It's the elbow of California, the red dot. And this is the site itself. And we've been working on this site, this 28,000 acre site, for now, I think 5 years. And there's a lot that goes into it. But what we came to recognize is how much, damage can be done by just humans occupying one particular space. You might think, okay, these people have come in, they haven't built anything, but they've just, taken out trees. And you can see that the water reservoir has now dried up by removing of trees. They've hurt the earth itself. And so it's going to take a very long time for us to restore, and having these carbon sequestrians and phyto issues to be resolved every time we build a building itself. And also every time we remove a plant, we also damage the food web itself, and so everything dies. But in a sense, what we decided was, how do we start designing mosques in a way that are coexistence, not just interfaith coexistence, but coexistence with every living being. So we went back to the whole earth as a mosque concept, and we restudied the issues of sustainability and responsibility. And when we got commissioned for the Islamic Center of Southern California, just to kind of give you a quick overview, it sits near Wilshire Boulevard. There are many famous buildings that are right next to it. So it's right in the heart of Los Angeles. There are absolutely no parks, no green infrastructure nearby. It's not a walkable city. But the community first came to us and they said, what we would like to do is we would like to build an additional 20,000 square feet on top of the mosque, so that we have more access to building spaces, because we just need more building spaces. And when we did an analysis on this, we said, okay, based on not only the 20,000 square feet that you want to do and the amount of money that you want to spend, do you recognize the damage that it's done when you build not only on top of your structure itself for structural purposes, but also the carbon emission that it's actually released? Whereas everybody needs to do, this is an Islamic center, it's a mosque, and there's no green spaces here. Everything is very, very hard, dense. What could be done is that you guys can actually create a sanctuary, not only for Muslims, but for every living creature that's there. So after doing a whole series of analysis, understanding sunrise and sunset, wind patterns, and etc., we came up with a whole series of architectural programming for them. So how much shade are they getting in the building? Because shade is essential when there's no trees on their property. Los Angeles can get up to 120 degrees. There are a lot of homeless people that are nearby, and actually being able to sit under a tree reduces the heat roughly about 20 degrees to 35 degrees, especially if the asphalt isn't hitting you in the face or tar. So those are really critical elements. We started thinking about green walls. How does a wall live, breathe, inhale? Can it become a place for butterflies, for grasshoppers, for other insects, because they become part of the whole network that's there. They're pollinators, so it's the flora and the fauna that's there. Can we create a generational garden that's known as the Jannah? So when someone dies, can we actually plant something in front of the mosque for them, a tree dedicated to them, rather than, their money just not doing anything for us? So then that way when their family comes to the mosque, they can actually remember their grandfather or remember their grandmother when they look at a tree or look at a specific plant. And what is the aesthetic, aspect of it? Earlier this morning, there was conversation about protection because there's so much vandalism. Do we just close everything off because we're Muslims and we go inside? Or is there a way that we can actually open this up and be inviting so that people can actually understand what we're doing beyond the concept of domes and minarets? So we did a whole series of conceptual ideas. We played with the verses of Watini wa Zaytun. We've thought about bringing in the exterior and the interior. I can go on into this for a lot of time. It's a lot of process. But I just put these in so everybody has an idea of how the process is actually done. But ultimately what it came down to was that the building itself used to be a bank. It was a mid-century modern building. It used to be a bank. So they nailed the idea of not contributing to carbon emission. But now we need to backtrack and fix the building itself so that it actually becomes a place for sanctuary purposes. Back in the 90s, they kind of did a little bit of just, what I call Band-Aid architecture. So they just, laid in a floor ceiling in there. They just kind of did a little bit of the parking. You can see the asphalt is not doing very well. The cafeteria area is just plastic and plastic chairs, plastic tables. Plastic is made out of oil, doesn't breathe very well, so it's not good. And so what we decided to do was really think about what is the American Muslim identity. They kept saying the Islamic Center of Southern California is the American Muslim identity. And I said, I don't understand, because your building is a mid-century modern bank. So are you bankers? Or what is happening here? Are we just talking about wealth? So they kept talking about, no, we need a new identity. And I said, okay, so I think your identity needs to be able to talk about the issues of sustainability. How do you open up the mosque so that it does have trees? It does allow for daylight to come in so that you're not using so much electricity. Beyond the notion of just solar panels to, have the whole mosque lit up, can we use wudu water for gray water purposes? So can it be rerouted for a garden itself? When you do have a garden, can it be beyond the idea of just a garden, but actually, a vegetable garden? Because then now you can have a soup kitchen that can, give back to the neighborhood for low-income families. And so a lot of ideas of like recycled wood came into play. A lot of ideas of natural materials came into play, because they were thinking before about importing mosaics from Morocco or Tunisia or for Egypt. And I kept saying, your carbon footprint of creating something Islamic is so damaging. So let's do something vernacular within the framework of Southern California. And then, of course, the idea of what are the spaces. So can a prayer space be for men and women? And before, just a footnote here, when they came to us in our office, I didn't have to remind them, that if you're coming to us, you do realize that your architect is a woman, and we're not having the discussion about gender issues. This is non-debatable. Men and women are going to be in the same space. So they understood that, what they were getting into. So the idea of programmatical spaces, of educational spaces versus, being opened up. But more importantly, it was the idea of taking away these very clustered spaces and really giving it life for the flora and fauna. So can we actually create homes for bees so that honey can grow? Is there a place for ants to be there so that their mounds can grow and in order for the flora and fauna to take place? Can birds be there? So we've taken this particular space. This was their dining area for now. You see what that looks like? And we basically broke it up into creating an indoor-outdoor space for them. And really working within the framework. So all we really did was just subtract the middle part of that space to give it a garden and allow for a space for people to be able to come in. And also this would be the only area, the only space within a 1 mile area where people can actually have a cafe to come and have a garden itself to sit down, to be an indoor-outdoor space. And the last thing I want to show you guys, do we have time? Are we okay?
Close.
Okay. Is our Preston Mosque, because that idea of creating these ecological mosques within an urban context has been really, we've been really trying to push this agenda in all sorts of our projects. And this one is across the pond. This is more now in Europe. And we've been trying to test out this idea also in Europe as well. So this is in London. This is, you can see the cluster of mosques down in London area. But this particular mosque in Preston is more of a rural area. So it's outside the city of London. But it's a home to a really big Muslim population that's there. They came to us and they said, there is this piece of land that we bought and it's right off the highway. And we want to build a mosque. And we want it to be an iconoclast, dome, minaret. We want to say, we are here. And I said, you are here, but I don't recall anywhere in the instruction guides from God in the Quran where God instructed us to build domes and minarets. I remember a niche, but I don't ever remember a dome or a minaret. And so working with them, I said, things have to be functional. And God talks more about the earth itself. He talks about when the two bodies of water meet. He talks about what you plant on the earth itself. He talks about rain. When you gather rainwater and you harvest through that, there's life that happens. Those were the instructions from God. But I'm still having a hard time with domes and minarets. So after so much conversation, this is their land. Across the street is a church. Down the road is also a Jewish temple. This is what they were working with. And so we started thinking about the different ways that we can basically use this land. And so these are some of the sketches that we first came up with. We gave them a minaret. We thought, I got really angry and I gave them 10 minarets all stuck together because they kept saying, I want the minaret. But we also then really talked about the idea of what are the verses in the Quran and how can we emulate the verses of the Quran. So we talked about Surah Nur, God is the light of the lantern. But then we really went into, again, the idea of Surah Watini wa Zaytun. So, what is the Mount Sinai? How important is that concept of mountain? What is the significance of a human being next to a mountain? Because it's so grand, and you're reminded of how small you are in the infiniteness of what God has created. So this became the final solution. What we did was, again, we created this indoor-outdoor space for them. The idea of a courtyard, right? It's there. But what we decided to do was actually create more of an arm reach. So this is kind of God reaching out and embracing everybody to come in. We also, created this courtyard that would have all of these living plants that would be there that are essential for that whole ecosystem of Preston. It would also allow for a farmers market activity to take place. So going back to the prophetic mosque, of the idea that a mosque isn't just a mosque, it has different architectural programmings that go with it. It also becomes an education institution without it necessarily saying that it's a madrasa, but a place where all the interfaiths can come together. We also talked about the idea of materiality, so porous materiality, not asphalt. How do we allow for the rain to fall and then gather into a central area, which that became an area where both the minaret was used to basically create filtration system. So the minaret is used for a filtration system so that it gathers underneath the ground, so it becomes a pool, and then that way the water is used to maintain the garden itself. And then the other things that we thought about was, how do we create these steps so that it is an emblem of a mountain, so you get to go up and to look at and think about God in different formations. But also, if you look, when we decided to do the Mount Sinan idea, you see that the roof is actually punctured. And the idea of that was that at nighttime, when, if it's the 15th of a certain month, it's a complete full moon, you get to see the night sky, but also the light. So these are all the astronomical aspects of it that come in through the domes into the mosque itself. So we went through really chapter by chapter, line by line, pulling out verses of everything that God has actually instructed us in the Quran to start building that into actually a building and a footprint that won't contribute to 40% carbon emission, but actually be really the whole earth is a mosque and the mosque is earth. So this is where we are now. I will let you guys know how we do. Thank you.